The mess hall on Naval Station Great Lakes smelled like powdered eggs and burnt coffee. It was 6:15 in the morning, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with that low, irritating hum that made everything feel colder than it already was. Outside, the Illinois wind cut through the barracks like a blade, but inside, 300 recruits sat shoulder to shoulder on metal benches, shoveling food into their mouths as fast as they could. That was the rule. You eat, you shut up, and you move on. Boot camp had a way of stripping people down to their most basic functions. Eat, sleep, train, repeat. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Colton stood near the back wall with her tray in hand, watching the room the way she always did. Not with suspicion, but with awareness. It was something she had learned a long time ago, back when watching a room could mean the difference between walking out alive or being carried out in a bag. She was not in combat anymore. She was an instructor now, assigned to help oversee the physical readiness program for new recruits. But old habits do not die. They do not even fade. They just settle into the bones like rust on iron, and they stay there forever. Sarah did not look like what most people expected when they heard the words Navy SEAL trained. She was 5'7", lean but not bulky, with brown hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that could pass for a high school math teacher. She did not have tattoos covering her arms. She did not walk around flexing or talking about her time in special operations. In fact, most people on the base had no idea about her background at all. Her file was classified in ways that made even senior officers raise their eyebrows. She liked it that way. She had spent most of her career being invisible, and she had no interest in changing that now. She had grown up in a small town outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina, the kind of place where Friday nights revolved around high school football and Sunday mornings revolved around church. Her father was a retired Army Ranger who had done 3 tours in Vietnam and never talked about any of them. Her mother was a nurse who worked double shifts at the VA hospital and came home smelling like antiseptic and sadness. Sarah was the middle child of 5 and the only girl. Her brothers were loud, physical, and competitive in the way that military families tend to produce. They wrestled in the backyard. They raced each other through the woods behind the house. They threw punches over who got the last piece of cornbread at dinner. Sarah kept up with all of it, not because she had to, but because something inside her refused to be left behind. By the time she was 12, she could outrun her older brother Marcus on a 3-mile trail. By 14, she was beating her younger brothers in arm wrestling matches that left them red-faced and furious. Her father watched all of this with quiet approval. He never told her she was tough. He never told her she was special. He just nodded the way he did when something met his standard, and that nod meant more to Sarah than any trophy or ribbon ever could. She enlisted in the Navy the week after her 18th birthday. Her mother cried. Her father handed her a pocket knife that had belonged to his father and said, "Keep your head low and your standards high." That was the most emotional thing he had ever said to her, and she carried those words like ammunition for the next 2 decades. Boot camp was easy for her, not because she was naturally gifted, but because she had been preparing for it her whole life without knowing it. The running, the push-ups, the sleep deprivation, the yelling, none of it surprised her. She had lived with 4 brothers and a father who believed that discomfort was a form of education. She graduated top of her class and was immediately flagged for advanced training. Her scores in physical fitness, marksmanship, and problem-solving were so high that they caught the attention of people who did not normally look at regular enlisted sailors. What happened next was something Sarah rarely talked about. And when she did, she kept the details thin. She was selected for a Joint Special Operations Training Pipeline, a program that did not officially exist in any public document. It was not the standard SEAL qualification course. Women were not yet formally admitted to that pipeline at the time. But there were programs, quiet ones, that operated in the spaces between official policy and operational necessity. Programs where the only qualification that mattered was whether you could do the job. Sarah could do the job. The training lasted 18 months. It took place in locations she was never allowed to name, in conditions that would have broken most people within the first week. She trained alongside men who had already earned their tridents, men who looked at her with open skepticism on day 1 and grudging respect by day 30. She learned combat diving in water so cold it made her teeth ache for hours afterward. She learned close-quarters combat from instructors who had more confirmed operations than they had birthdays. She learned how to clear a room, how to read a threat, how to neutralize a target with her bare hands if every weapon failed. The hand-to-hand combat training was the part that changed her the most. Not physically, although her body became a weapon in ways she had never imagined. It changed her mentally. She learned to read aggression the way a musician reads sheet music. She could feel a fight coming before the first fist was thrown. The shift in someone's weight, the tension in their jaw, the way their eyes narrowed just a fraction of a second before they moved. These were the signals, and once she learned to read them, she could never unread them. She completed the training. She was one of only 3 people in her class who did. The other 2 were men with years of special operations experience. She was 20 years old. The years that followed were a blur of deployments, briefings, and operations that she would take to her grave. She served in places that the news never mentioned. She did things that no medal could properly honor because no medal could be publicly given. She was wounded twice, once in her left shoulder and once in her right thigh. And both times she was back on her feet within weeks, because the mission did not wait for anyone to heal. By the time she was 32, her body had started to send her messages she could not ignore. Her knees ached when it rained. Her shoulder clicked when she raised her arm above her head. She had headaches that lasted for days after certain types of training. The Navy doctors told her she had the joints of a 50-year-old and the scar tissue of someone who had been in a car accident. She had never been in a car accident. She had just spent 12 years doing things that cars could not survive. She transitioned out of the operational world and into training. It was not a demotion. It was a recognition that her value had shifted. She knew things that could not be taught from textbooks. She understood what it meant to push a human body past its limits and still function. She understood fear, real fear, the kind that makes your hands shake in your vision tunnel, and she understood how to move through it. That knowledge was worth more than another deployment. It was worth sharing. So she ended up at Great Lakes, standing in mess halls and on training fields, watching recruits stumble through the earliest days of their military careers. Most of them were kids, 18, 19, 20 years old. Scared and pretending not to be. Tough and pretending it came naturally. She saw herself in some of them, and she saw disasters waiting to happen in others. The recruit who would change everything walked into her awareness on a Tuesday morning during the 3rd week of the current training cycle. His name was Kyle Briggs. He was 21 years old, 6'2", 220 pounds, and built like someone who had spent the last 4 years in a gym with something to prove. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved from concrete, and eyes that never seemed to blink at the right time. He was from Houston, Texas, and he had a record that the recruiters had somehow overlooked, or more likely, chosen to ignore, because his physical test scores were exceptional. Sarah noticed him the way she noticed all potential problems, not with alarm, but with a quiet internal note, like a bookmark placed in a page she knew she would need to return to. Kyle was not a bad person. She did not believe in labeling people that easily, but he was a person with patterns, and those patterns were visible to anyone who knew what to look for. He walked too close to people, not in the way that crowded conditions forced, but deliberately, as if proximity was a statement. He held eye contact for too long, not with curiosity, but with challenge. When instructors corrected him, his body would tense in a specific way that Sarah recognized from years of reading threats. His shoulders would roll forward slightly, his chin would drop, and his fingers would curl toward his palms. It was not conscious. It was reflexive. It was the body language of someone who had learned early in life that authority was something to be challenged, not respected. During physical training sessions, Kyle pushed himself harder than anyone else in his division. He ran faster, did more push-ups, and lasted longer in every endurance exercise. But he did all of it with an aggression that crossed the line between determination and hostility. When he ran at people rather than past them. When he did push-ups, he slammed the ground like it had insulted him. The other recruits gave him space, not out of respect but out of instinct. They could feel what Sarah could see. Something inside Kyle Briggs was wound too tight, and it was looking for a reason to snap. The other instructors noticed it too. Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had been training recruits for 15 years, pulled Sarah aside one afternoon near the obstacle course and said what everyone was thinking. "That Briggs kid is going to be a problem. I can smell it." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She had learned a long time ago that predictions were less useful than preparations. She began watching Kyle more closely. Not following him, not singling him out, but adjusting her awareness to include him whenever he was in the same space. She noticed that he had a particular issue with female authority. When male instructors gave orders, he complied, even if his body language screamed resentment. But when female instructors spoke, something shifted in his expression. His lip would curl, almost imperceptibly, and his compliance would come a half-second slower, as if he needed that extra moment to swallow something bitter. Sarah had seen this before many times. In boot camp, in operational units, in the civilian world, there were men who could not separate the concept of authority from the concept of gender, and when the two did not align with their expectations, something short-circuited in their processing. They did not always become violent. Most of the time, they just became difficult, passive-aggressive, the kind of friction that wore down a unit slowly, rather than breaking it all at once. But sometimes, with the right pressure and the right moment, that friction caught fire. The first real incident happened during the second week of Kyle's training. A female instructor named Petty Officer Second Class Dana Herrera was leading a drill on the grinder, the large asphalt area where recruits practiced formations and calisthenics. Herrera was experienced, firm and fair, exactly the kind of instructor that good recruits thrived under and bad ones resented. She corrected Kyle's form during a set of flutter kicks, telling him his back was arching and he needed to press his lower spine into the ground. Kyle looked at her for a long moment without moving. The other recruits continued their exercise, but a few glanced sideways, sensing the tension. Herrera repeated the correction, louder this time. Kyle adjusted his form with exaggerated slowness, as if each movement was a favor he was granting rather than an order he was following. Herrera noted it but did not escalate. She was professional. She moved on. But Sarah, who had been observing from 30 yards away near the pull-up bars, saw what Herrera could not. After Herrera turned her back, Kyle's face changed. For just a second, maybe less, an expression crossed his features that made Sarah's stomach tighten. It was not anger. Anger she could handle. It was contempt, pure and focused, the kind that does not burn out, but instead smolders and waits. She filed it away. The days continued. Kyle performed well in all measurable categories. His scores were consistently near the top of his division. He could swim, shoot, and march with the best of them. On paper, he was exactly the kind of recruit the Navy wanted. Strong, capable, and driven. But Sarah had spent too many years reading between the lines to trust paper. Paper did not show you what someone's eyes did when they thought no one was watching. Paper did not capture the way a person's hands moved when they were replaying a scenario in their head that had not happened yet. She brought her concerns to the division officer, a young lieutenant named Patterson who was competent but inexperienced. Patterson listened politely, reviewed Kyle's records, and said what Sarah expected him to say. His numbers are excellent. He hasn't violated any regulations. We can't flag someone for body language. He was not wrong. The system was designed to process people through measurable criteria, and Kyle met every one of them. The system did not have a checkbox for the look in someone's eyes. Sarah did not push the issue. She had learned that pushing rarely changed minds. Instead, she adjusted her own behavior. She made sure she was present during more of Kyle's training sessions. She positioned herself in his line of sight more often, not confrontationally, but visibly. She wanted him to know on some level that he might not even consciously register, that he was being watched by someone who understood what she was seeing. The mess hall became the place where the tension was most visible. Meals were the only time recruits were stationary for an extended period, and stationary bodies give away more than moving ones. During meals, Sarah could see how Kyle interacted with the people around him. He sat at the end of the bench whenever possible, claiming space the way territorial animals do. He ate quickly and aggressively, his jaw working like machinery. He watched the female staff members who served food with that same barely perceptible curl of his lip, and Sarah noticed that he always chose to receive his tray from a male server if one was available. It was during one of these meal observations that she first noticed him watching her specifically. She was standing near the exit holding her own tray, talking with Rodriguez about the afternoon schedule. She felt it before she saw it. that familiar sensation of being targeted. The same feeling she had felt in dark rooms in countries she could not name, when someone on the other side of a wall was deciding whether or not to pull a trigger. She turned her head casually, not quickly enough to appear reactive, and found Kyle staring at her from across the room. He did not look away. Most recruits, when caught staring at an officer, would drop their gaze immediately. Kyle held it. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Then he looked down at his tray and continued eating. And Sarah felt the temperature in the room drop by a degree that no one else noticed. Rodriguez was still talking about the afternoon schedule, something about a change in the swimming qualification timeline. Sarah responded with the appropriate words, but her mind was already somewhere else. It was in a place she had not visited in years, a place where every interaction was a potential threat assessment, and every room was a potential battlefield. She did not want to be in that place. She had worked hard to leave it, but Kyle Briggs had opened a door that she thought she had locked, and she could feel the old instincts flooding back in like water through a crack in a dam. That night, in her quarters, she sat on the edge of her bed and ran through the scenario in her head the way she had been trained to run through scenarios. She identified the variables. Kyle was physically large, aggressive by nature, and had a specific issue with women in authority positions. She was a woman in an authority position who had been visibly present during his training. She had made eye contact. In his mind, that could register as a challenge, and men like Kyle did not let challenges go unanswered. She considered the possibility that she was overreacting. It had been years since she had been in a genuinely dangerous situation. Maybe her threat detection was miscalibrated, tuned too sensitive by too many years of high-stakes environments. Maybe Kyle was just a difficult recruit who would wash out on his own or eventually learn to follow orders. Maybe the look in his eyes was nothing more than the frustrated pride of a young man adjusting to a world where he was not in control. But then she thought about the 18 months of training that had taught her to trust her instincts above all else. She thought about the instructors who had drilled into her that the moment you start second-guessing your gut is the moment you become a casualty. She thought about the operations where her instincts had saved lives, including her own, and she decided that she would rather be wrong and prepared than right and caught off guard. She set her alarm for 5 in the morning, 30 minutes earlier than usual. She would be in the mess hall before Kyle Briggs, and she would be ready for whatever was building behind those unblinking eyes. She did not know exactly what was coming. She just knew that it was coming. The only question was when. She turned off the light and lay in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the windows of her quarters. Somewhere across the base, 300 recruits were sleeping in their racks, dreaming about whatever recruits dream about. Glory, maybe. Home, probably. Fear, almost certainly. And one of them, she was sure, was not dreaming about any of those things. One of them was lying awake in the dark, just like her, running through a scenario in his head. And in that scenario, he was not the one who lost. Sarah closed her eyes and let her breathing slow. She had faced worse odds in worse places with worse outcomes on the line. This was a mess hall in Illinois, not a compound in a war zone. But the principle was the same. Readiness was not about the size of the threat. It was about the size of the consequences if you were not ready. She slept lightly, the way she always did, the way she had been trained to, the way she would probably sleep for the rest of her life. And when her alarm went off at 5, she was already awake, already dressed, already running through the layout of the mess hall in her mind, identifying exits, sight lines, and distances between tables. She was not afraid. Fear was an old friend she had made peace with years ago. She was simply ready. And for someone like Sarah Colton, ready was the most dangerous thing a person could be. The morning was still dark when she stepped outside. The cold hit her face like a slap, and she welcomed it. Cold sharpened the senses. Cold kept you alert. She walked toward the mess hall with steady, measured steps, her boots crunching on the frost-covered sidewalk. And she thought about something her father had told her when she was 9 years old, standing at the edge of the woods with a flashlight in her hand, afraid to go in but too proud to say so. "Fear is just your body telling you to pay attention," he had said. "The only people who should worry are the ones who are not afraid, because those are the ones who are not paying attention." Sarah Colton was paying attention. She had been paying attention her whole life. And right now, every nerve in her body was telling her that the next few days were going to require every ounce of attention she had. She pushed open the door of the mess hall and stepped inside. The lights were already on, humming their low, irritating hum. The kitchen staff was beginning their prep, the clatter of pans and the hiss of grills filling the empty room with the sounds of routine. Sarah set her tray down at a table near the back wall where she could see every entrance and every exit, and she waited. She was very good at waiting. It was one of the first things they had taught her all those years ago in that training pipeline that did not officially exist. Patience is a weapon, her lead instructor had said. The person who can wait the longest almost always wins. Sarah had taken that lesson to heart. She had once spent 42 hours in a concealed position without moving more than her eyes, waiting for a target that never appeared. Compared to that, waiting in a warm mess hall with coffee and powdered eggs was practically a vacation. The recruits would start arriving in 30 minutes. Kyle Briggs would be among them. And whatever was going to happen would happen on Sarah's terms, in Sarah's space, at Sarah's pace. Because that was the other thing they had taught her in training, the lesson that had saved her life more times than she could count. Never let someone else choose the battlefield. Choose it yourself, and then make sure you know every inch of it before the first shot is fired. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and watched the door. The coffee was terrible. The morning was cold. The lights were buzzing. And somewhere on this base, a young man with rage in his eyes and violence in his hands was about to make the worst decision of his life. He just did not know it yet. The next several days passed with the kind of surface-level normalcy that Sarah had learned never to trust. Training cycles at Great Lakes followed a rigid schedule. Recruits woke at the same time, ate at the same time, drilled at the same time, and slept at the same time. The repetition was deliberate. It was designed to strip away individuality and replace it with discipline, to turn 300 strangers into a single functioning unit. For most recruits, the process worked exactly the way it was supposed to. They resisted at first, then adapted, then eventually found a strange kind of comfort in the predictability. The ones who thrived were the ones who learned to let go of their need to control everything. Kyle Briggs was not letting go of anything. Sarah watched him through every meal, every formation, every training evolution, and what she saw was a man at war with himself. On the outside, he was performing. His run times were improving. His drill movements were sharp. He followed orders with mechanical precision and never gave the instructors a reason to single him out. If she had been watching from a distance, through the lens of numbers and reports, she would have seen a model recruit. But Sarah was not watching from a distance. She was watching from the place where body language met intention, and what she saw there was a pressure cooker with a faulty valve. The signs were small, the kind of things that only someone with her training would catch. During morning calisthenics, Kyle positioned himself at the back of the formation, where he could see everyone but no one could easily see him. When the group moved between locations, he walked at the outer edge of the column, never in the middle, always maintaining a buffer of space that he controlled. At meals, he had started sitting closer to the center of the tables rather than at the ends, which seemed like a small change but told Sarah something significant. He was no longer just claiming territory. He was positioning himself where he could reach more people if he needed to. Whether he was conscious of this shift or not did not matter. His body was preparing for something that his mind might not have fully decided on yet. The dynamic between Kyle and the female instructors had not improved. If anything, it had become more controlled, which worried Sarah more than open defiance would have. Open defiance could be addressed. It was visible, documented, and actionable. What Kyle was doing was different. He had learned to mask his contempt with compliance, to follow orders from women while radiating a silent hostility that was felt but could never be pointed to on paper. He had figured out the system's blind spot, and he was living inside it. Petty Officer Herrera, the instructor he had clashed with during the flutter kick incident, had noticed the change and mentioned it to Sarah one afternoon while they were reviewing the week's training schedule in the instructor office. "Briggs has been clean," Herrera said, flipping through her notes. "No incidents, no attitude. He even helped one of the weaker swimmers during pool qualifications yesterday." She said it with cautious optimism, the way people do when they want to believe that a problem has solved itself. Sarah nodded but did not share the optimism. She had seen this pattern before, in recruits and in operational targets and in people she had been sent to study, in countries where behavior analysis was not an academic exercise but a survival tool. When someone with Kyle's profile suddenly becomes compliant, it does not mean the anger is gone. It means the anger has found a plan. A person who is still deciding what to do is unpredictable and often messy. A person who is decided is calm, organized, and frighteningly efficient. Kyle was becoming calm. She spent her evenings reviewing his file again, looking for patterns she might have missed the first time. His background told a story that was both common and tragic in its familiarity. He had grown up in a part of Houston where the houses were small and the problems were big. His father had left before his second birthday. His mother had worked 2 jobs and still could not keep the lights on. Every month, he had been raised primarily by his older sister, who was only 4 years ahead of him and barely capable of raising herself. The school record showed a smart kid who had stopped trying somewhere around the 6th grade. His test scores in elementary school were in the top percentile. By middle school, they had dropped to average. By high school, he was barely passing. The disciplinary file was thick. Fights, mostly. 6 in middle school, 11 in high school. He had been suspended 4 times and expelled once from an alternative school that was supposed to be the last stop before juvenile detention. The fights followed a pattern that Sarah recognized. In almost every case, the incident was triggered by a perceived challenge to his authority or his masculinity. Someone looked at him wrong. Someone said something he interpreted as disrespect. Someone bumped into him in a hallway and did not apologize fast enough. The interesting thing was that Kyle had never started a fight with anyone who was bigger or stronger than him. Every single opponent in his file was smaller, weaker, or caught off guard. He did not seek out fair fights. He sought out situations where the outcome was guaranteed, where he could demonstrate dominance without risking defeat. This was not the profile of a fighter. It was the profile of a predator, someone who confused power with safety, and who believed that the only way to be secure was to make sure everyone around him was afraid. He had joined the Navy after running out of options. No college would take him with his grades and disciplinary record. The jobs available to him in Houston paid minimum wage and offered no way out. A recruiter had found him at a job fair, seen his physical potential, and sold him on the idea of a fresh start. Kyle had signed the papers the same day, probably believing that the military would be a place where his aggression was valued rather than punished. What he had not understood was that the military valued controlled aggression, the kind that could be aimed and directed and turned off when the mission was over. Uncontrolled aggression was not an asset. It was a liability, and in a place where people carried weapons and operated heavy machinery, it was a danger to everyone in the vicinity. Sarah understood Kyle in a way that troubled her, not because she sympathized with his violence, but because she recognized the raw material beneath it. He was strong, determined, and capable of intense focus. In a different life, with different circumstances, he might have been exactly the kind of person who thrived in special operations, but the wiring was wrong. The aggression that could have been his greatest weapon had been shaped by years of chaos and insecurity into something toxic and undirected. He did not want to serve. He wanted to dominate. And those two impulses, while they sometimes looked the same from the outside, led to very different outcomes. On Thursday of the 4th week, something happened that accelerated the timeline Sarah had been mentally constructing. During a group PT session on the grinder, a recruit named Davis, a small, quiet kid from Oregon, who weighed maybe 160 pounds soaking wet, accidentally stepped on Kyle's foot during a formation change. It was the kind of thing that happened 50 times a day in boot camp. Bodies in close proximity, moving quickly on command, colliding in minor ways that meant nothing. Kyle's reaction was immediate and visceral. He shoved Davis with both hands, sending the smaller recruit stumbling backward into the recruit behind him. The whole thing lasted less than 2 seconds. By the time the nearest instructor turned around, Kyle was back in position, his face neutral, his body still. Davis was picking himself up, confused and embarrassed but uninjured. No one had seen the shove clearly enough to report it. It was Kyle's word against Davis's. And in the chaotic environment of group PT, physical contact was ambiguous enough to be dismissed. But Sarah had seen it. She was standing near the water station 40 feet away, and she had seen every millisecond of the interaction. She had seen the shove, yes, but more importantly, she had seen what came before it. The moment Davis's foot made contact with Kyle's, something flashed across Kyle's face that was not anger, but recognition. It was the look of a man who had found his excuse, even if the excuse lasted only a fraction of a second. The shove was not a reaction. It was a release, a controlled venting of pressure through a target that could not fight back. Sarah walked over to Davis after the session and asked him if he was all right. Davis said he was fine, just lost his balance, clearly not wanting to make trouble. Sarah did not push him. She just told him to be careful in tight formations and moved on. But she filed the incident in the mental dossier she had been building on Kyle Briggs, and the dossier was getting thick enough to concern her. She went to Lieutenant Patterson again that afternoon. This time, she brought specifics: the shove, the body language patterns, the behavioral profile she had constructed from his file, and her observations. Patterson listened more carefully this time. He was a good officer, if inexperienced, and he could tell that Sarah was not the type to raise alarms without cause. But the system was the system. A shove during PT, unwitnessed by official staff and denied by the person accused, was not enough to initiate any formal action. Patterson told her he would make a note in Kyle's file and increase instructor presence during his division's training evolutions. It was the most he could do within the rules, and they both knew it was not enough. Sarah left Patterson's office with the familiar frustration of someone who could see a threat that the system was not designed to recognize. In the operational world, she had worked with teams that trusted her judgment implicitly. If she said someone was dangerous, that assessment was acted on immediately and without question. But the training command was not the operational world. Here, action required evidence, documentation, and process. Here, instinct was not admissible. She understood the reasons for this. She even agreed with them in principle. A system that punished people based on one person's gut feeling was a system ripe for abuse. But understanding the principle did not make the reality any less dangerous. She decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to work through the system, she would work around it, not by breaking any rules, but by changing the variables of the equation. If she could not remove Kyle from the environment, she could at least ensure that when the inevitable happened, the outcome would be controlled. She started by adjusting her own schedule to align more closely with Kyle's division. She volunteered for additional mess hall duty during their meal times. And she offered to assist with their swimming qualifications, their rifle training, and their classroom instruction on military customs and curses. None of this was unusual. Instructors frequently helped with other divisions, especially during the busiest weeks of the training cycle. No one questioned why Lieutenant Commander Colton was suddenly so interested in Division 199. Kyle noticed, though. Sarah could tell because his behavior changed again, subtly but unmistakably, whenever she was present. He became more rigid, more careful, as if her presence added a layer of scrutiny that made him uncomfortable. He stopped positioning himself at the edges of formations and instead moved toward the center, surrounded by other bodies. He ate his meals faster. He avoided looking in her direction, which told Sarah more than if he had been staring. People do not deliberately avoid looking at things that do not matter to them. Avoidance is its own form of attention, and Kyle was paying a lot of attention to not paying attention to her. The other recruits in Division 189 were starting to show the wear of the fourth week. This was typical. Weeks 3 through 5 were the hardest part of boot camp, the period when the initial adrenaline of arrival had worn off, but the end was still too far away to see. Recruits got sick, homesick, and heartsick. They made mistakes. They cried in the showers when they thought no one could hear. They wrote letters home that they tore up before mailing. The strong ones pushed through. The weak ones broke. And the dangerous ones, the ones like Kyle, used the suffering around them as fuel. Sarah noticed that Kyle had begun to cultivate a small following within the division. Not a gang, nothing that organized, but a loose collection of recruits who gravitated toward his confidence and physical presence. They were the ones who laughed at his quiet comments during Chow, the ones who saved him a seat, the ones who looked to him for cues on how to react when the instructors pushed them hard. It was a natural dynamic in any group under pressure. People look for leaders, and in the absence of formal ones, they find informal ones. Kyle had positioned himself as an informal leader, and his followers did not realize that the confidence they admired was actually something much less admirable. Among his informal group was a recruit named Torres, a nervous kid from New Jersey who had joined the Navy to escape a situation at home that he never talked about but that everyone could guess at from the flinch he made whenever someone raised their voice unexpectedly. Torres followed Kyle like a shadow, not out of admiration but out of fear disguised as loyalty. He did whatever Kyle told him to do, from saving seats to fetching extra napkins, to standing watch, while Kyle did things that were technically against regulations, but too minor to warrant official notice. Sarah watched this dynamic develop with a cold knot in her stomach. She had seen it before in different contexts, the charismatic aggressor, who surrounded himself with compliant followers, using their obedience as both armor and validation. In Kyle's mind, the fact that other recruits deferred to him confirmed his belief that dominance was the natural order of things. The more people obeyed him, the more entitled he felt to their obedience, and the more dangerous he became when that obedience was not forthcoming. The mess hall remained the epicenter of her concerns. It was the one place where the rigid structure of boot camp relaxed just enough to allow for the kind of interactions that exposed true character. During training evolutions, every movement was scripted and supervised, but at meals, even with the strict no-talking rule, there were small windows of unsupervised humanity. Glances exchanged, trays positioned, bodies angled. In those small windows, Sarah could see the social architecture of Division 189 as clearly as a blueprint, and Kyle Briggs was building himself into the load-bearing wall. On Monday of the 5th week, Sarah arrived at the mess hall at 5:45 in the morning, 30 minutes before the 1st Division was scheduled to eat. She had developed a routine of arriving early, getting her coffee, and selecting a position that gave her maximum visibility. The kitchen staff knew her by now and greeted her with the easy familiarity of people who shared early mornings. She liked them. They were civilians mostly, men and women who had been cooking for sailors for years and who had seen every kind of recruit come through those doors. They did not know about her background and she did not tell them. To them, she was just the officer who liked her coffee black and her eggs scrambled. She took her usual spot near the back wall and began reviewing the day's training schedule on her tablet. Division 189 had a full day ahead. Morning PT, followed by damage control training, followed by a classroom block on the Uniform Code of Military Justice, followed by afternoon chow, followed by swimming qualifications. It was a punishing schedule, designed to push recruits to their limits and see who could still function when exhausted. Fatigue was a tool in boot camp, used deliberately to strip away pretense and reveal who people really were when they had nothing left to hide behind. Sarah knew that fatigue would be a factor in whatever was coming with Kyle. Tired people make decisions they would not make when rested. Their impulse control weakens. Their emotional regulation degrades. The filters that keep the ugliest parts of human nature locked away start to thin, and things slip through that would normally stay hidden. Kyle, who already had thin filters on his best day, would be operating with almost none by the time afternoon chow arrived. She made a decision that she had been considering for several days. She would position herself in the mess hall during Division 189's afternoon meal, not as an observer in the back, but as an active presence. She would walk the floor. She would be visible, close, and unavoidable. If Kyle's escalation was coming, and every instinct she had told her it was, she wanted it to happen where she could control it. Better a confrontation in a supervised environment than an incident in a barracks hallway at 2 in the morning. The morning passed without incident. Sarah conducted PT with a different division, ran through paperwork in the instructor office, and attended a staff meeting where the commanding officer discussed the upcoming graduation timeline. She said nothing about Kyle Briggs during the meeting. She had said what she needed to say to the people who needed to hear it, and pushing further would only mark her as alarmist. In the military, as in most large organizations, there was a fine line between vigilance and paranoia, and crossing it meant losing credibility that might be needed later. At 1300 hours, she positioned herself in the mess hall. Division 189 was scheduled for chow at 13:30. She had 30 minutes to prepare. She checked the layout of the room for the 100th time. The tables were arranged in long rows bolted to the floor with attached benches that swiveled but could not be removed. The food service line ran along the north wall. The exits were east and west, standard double doors with crash bars. The floor was linoleum, recently mopped, slightly slick in places. The ceiling was 12 feet high with exposed ductwork and fluorescent lighting panels. There were no blind spots from her position at the back wall. although the structural column near the center of the room partially blocked the view of the northeast corner. She made a mental note of the column and adjusted her plan to account for it. If something happened near that corner, she would need to move 3 additional steps to get a clear line of sight. 3 steps was about 1.5 seconds at a controlled walk, less than a second at a full sprint. Acceptable, but not ideal. She shifted her position 2 feet to the left, which opened up the angle and reduced the blind spot to approximately 4 inches. That was manageable. The kitchen staff was loading the serving line with the afternoon meal. Chicken patties, green beans, rice, and fruit cups. The usual utilitarian spread that kept 300 bodies fueled without inspiring anyone. Sarah could hear the cook arguing with the supplier on the phone about a delivery of frozen vegetables that had arrived thawed. Normal sounds. Normal day. Except that nothing about this day felt normal to Sarah, and she had learned a long time ago to trust that feeling. At 13:28, she heard them before she saw them. The sound of 300 boots hitting pavement in unison, the bark of instructors counting cadence, the synchronized breathing of bodies moving as one. Division 189 was arriving. Sarah set down her coffee and stood up straight, her weight balanced evenly on both feet, her hands at her sides, her eyes on the east entrance where the division would enter. The doors opened and recruits began filing in, row by row, moving to their assigned tables with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 200 times before. They sat down in order, back straight, eyes forward, hands on their laps until given permission to eat. The instructors took their positions at the corners of the room, clipboards in hand, scanning the rows for any deviation from protocol. Sarah watched Kyle enter. He was in the middle of the formation, which was unusual. He normally positioned himself near the back. His face was neutral, his movements precise. He sat down at his assigned spot and placed his hands on his lap like everyone else. From every measurable angle, he was a recruit following the rules. But Sarah noticed that his hands were not relaxed on his lap. They were pressed flat against his thighs, fingers spread, as if he was bracing against something. And his breathing was faster than it should have been for someone who had just walked 100 yards from the training building. His chest was rising and falling with the shallow, rapid rhythm of someone whose body was preparing for something that had not yet begun. The order came to eat. 300 recruits rose in unison, moved to the food line, received their trays, and returned to their seats. The process took exactly 4 minutes. Then the room filled with the sound of forks on plastic trays and the quiet business of consumption. No talking. No eye contact between recruits. Just eating as fast as possible, because the schedule did not wait for anyone to enjoy their meal. Sarah picked up her own tray and began walking the floor. She moved slowly, casually, the way a teacher might patrol a study hall. She made small talk with the instructors she passed. She glanced at trays to make sure recruits were eating. She was a picture of routine authority, and to anyone watching, there was nothing unusual about her presence. She walked past Kyle's table. He was eating his chicken patty with mechanical efficiency, not looking up, not acknowledging her presence. But as she passed behind him, she saw his shoulders rise by a fraction of an inch. It was the smallest movement imaginable, so small that a camera would not have caught it. But Sarah was not a camera. She was a human weapon system with 18 years of training in reading the human body, and she knew what that shoulder rise meant. It meant that every muscle in Kyle Briggs' back had just tensed in response to her proximity. He knew she was there. He knew she was watching. And whatever decision he had been building toward for the past 5 weeks, it was almost fully formed now. She could feel it in the air between them, as tangible as humidity, as undeniable as gravity. Something was going to happen. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Soon. Maybe today. Maybe in the next few minutes. The energy in Kyle's body had the coiled, compressed quality of something that could not be held much longer. Sarah completed her circuit of the room and returned to her position near the back wall. She stood there, tray in hand, watching the room with the same calm expression she had worn in briefing rooms before operations that had a 30% casualty estimate. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear, running through scenarios and responses the way a chess player runs through moves and countermoves. She took a bite of her chicken patty and waited. The buzzing lights above continued their low, irritating hum. 300 forks continued their rhythm against 300 trays. And at a table near the center of the room, a young man with rage in his bones and a plan in his head continued eating his meal with mechanical precision, unaware that the woman standing 30 feet behind him had fought in wars he had never heard of and survived things he could not imagine. The clock on the wall ticked toward 13:45. 15 minutes into the meal, 15 minutes until the order to clear trays and form up outside. It's 15 minutes that felt like they were moving through syrup, each second stretching and distorting under the weight of what was coming. Sarah took another bite, chewed, swallowed, watched. Kyle set down his fork, picked up his napkin, wiped his mouth, set the napkin down, and then he turned around on the bench and looked directly at her. Not a glance. Not a quick check, a full deliberate turn of his body rotating on the bench until he was facing her across 30 feet of linoleum floor, and his eyes locked onto hers with the flat, empty intensity of someone who had stopped calculating consequences. Sarah met his gaze and held it. She did not blink. She did not tense. She did not adjust her posture. She simply stood there, tray in hand, chicken patty half eaten, and looked back at him with the steady calm of a person who had been looked at by far more dangerous eyes in far more dangerous places. For 5 seconds, they held each other's gaze across the mess hall. 5 seconds that contained an entire conversation without a single word being spoken. In those 5 seconds, Kyle Briggs told Sarah Colton exactly what he was planning to do, and Sarah Colton told Kyle Briggs, in the quiet language of her absolute stillness, that she was ready for it. Then Kyle turned back around and resumed eating, and the moment passed like a wave retreating from the shore. But the water level had changed. Something had been committed to that could not be uncommitted. Sarah felt it with the certainty of someone who had survived too many close calls to doubt her own perception. The conversation in those 5 seconds had not been a warning. It had been a declaration. She finished her meal standing up. She did not sit down. She did not lean against the wall. She stood on balanced feet, with her weight centered and her hands free, and she watched the remaining 10 minutes of Division 189's Chow period, with the total consuming attention of a person who understood that the difference between a controlled outcome and a catastrophe could be measured in seconds. When the order came to clear trays, 300 recruits rose in unison and moved toward the collection point. Kyle rose with them, placed his tray on the stack, and filed toward the exit with the rest of his division. As he passed Sarah's position near the back wall, he did not look at her. He did not need to. The declaration had been made. The next time he turned to face her, it would not be across 30 feet of empty space. It would be much, much closer. Sarah watched him leave and then stood alone in the emptying mess hall for a long moment, listening to the kitchen staff begin their cleanup and thinking about what she had just seen. She thought about the training that had prepared her for moments exactly like this. 1. She thought about the scars on her shoulder and her thigh and the ones that did not show on her skin but lived somewhere deeper. She thought about her father handing her that pocket knife and telling her to keep her head low and her standards high. Then she set down her tray, pulled out her phone, and sent a text message to Chief Rodriguez. 3 words. Tomorrow. Be ready. She put the phone back in her pocket and walked out of the mess hall into the gray Illinois afternoon. The wind hit her face and she did not flinch. She had stopped flinching a long time ago. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. The morning arrived the way mornings always arrived at Great Lakes, gray and cold and ruthlessly on schedule. Sarah was awake before her alarm for the second time in a week, lying in the dark with her eyes open, running through the day ahead like a pilot running through a pre-flight checklist. She had slept 4 hours, maybe less, and she felt sharp in the way that only people who have trained under sleep deprivation can feel sharp. There was a clarity that came with exhaustion when you knew how to use it. A stripping away of unnecessary thought that left only the essential functions behind. Observe. Assess, act. Everything else was noise, and Sarah had spent 18 years learning to filter noise. She dressed in her working uniform, laced her boots with the automatic precision of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and checked her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Brown hair, tight bun, no makeup, no jewelry. The face looking back at her was calm, composed, and entirely unremarkable. That was the point. In her operational career, Her greatest asset had never been strength or speed or combat skill. It had been her ability to be overlooked. People saw a woman of average height with a pleasant face and a quiet voice, and they categorized her instantly as non-threatening. By the time they realized their mistake, the situation was already over. She thought about Kyle Briggs and the look he had given her in the mess hall the day before. That flat, empty stare that had carried the weight of a decision already made. She had seen that look in other eyes, in other countries, in rooms that smelled like sweat and gunpowder and fear. The look of a person who had crossed an internal line and was now operating on the other side of it, where consequences were abstract and action was everything. Kyle had crossed that line sometime during the night, or maybe during the 5 seconds of eye contact they had shared across the mess hall. Either way, he was past the point where talking or counseling or disciplinary threats would change what was coming. His body had committed to something that his mind might still be negotiating with, but the body always won those negotiations in the end. She left her quarters at 0500 and walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the mess hall. The base was quiet at this hour, just the distant hum of generators and the occasional shout of a duty officer. She passed the barracks where Division 189 was sleeping, or trying to sleep, and she wondered if Kyle was awake in there right now, lying on his rack with his eyes open, the same way she had been lying on hers. Two people in the same building, both preparing for the same moment from opposite sides of the equation. Chief Rodriguez was already in the mess hall when she arrived. He was sitting at a table near the east entrance with a cup of coffee that looked like it had been sitting there long enough to grow a personality. Rodriguez was 52 years old, built like a refrigerator that had been welded to a set of legs, and had the face of someone who had seen everything at least twice, and found most of it disappointing. He had been a master-at-arms for 12 years before transitioning to recruit training, and he understood threat assessment in a practical, ground-level way that complemented Sarah's more specialized knowledge. She sat down across from him and they spoke quietly for 20 minutes. She told him what she had observed, what she expected, and what she needed from him. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she respected most about him. He did not ask her if she was sure. He did not question her assessment. He had worked with her long enough to know that when Sarah Colton said something was coming, it was coming. They agreed on a plan. Rodriguez would position himself near the food service line during Division 189's breakfast chow, close enough to respond, but far enough to appear casual. 2 additional instructors, Petty Officer Hernandez and Petty Officer Wallace, would be briefed and positioned at the east and west exits respectively. Sarah would take her usual position near the back wall. The idea was not to create a visible security presence that might either deter Kyle or escalate him prematurely. The idea was to create an invisible net that could close in the moment it was needed. "What if nothing happens?" Rodriguez asked, as he stood up to leave. Sarah looked at him with the calm, unblinking expression that Rodriguez had learned to recognize as her operational face. "Then we will have had a very boring breakfast," she said. "But I would rather be bored and wrong than relaxed and right." Rodriguez nodded, dumped his cold coffee in the trash, and went to brief Hernandez and Wallace. Sarah stayed at the table and watched the kitchen staff begin their morning routine. Trays stacked, eggs cracked, grills heated. The machinery of feeding 300 people hummed to life around her, and she sat in the middle of it like a stone in a stream, still and watchful while everything moved. Division 189 was scheduled for breakfast chow at 0615. They had a full day ahead, their toughest yet, Battle Stations Week, the culminating event of boot camp, where everything they had learned was tested in a continuous 12-hour evolution that simulated shipboard emergencies. Recruits arrived at battle stations exhausted from weeks of training and left either as sailors or as washouts. The stress was immense. The physical demands were brutal, and the emotional pressure was designed to break anyone who was not ready. Sarah knew that Battle Stations Week changed the calculus of her situation. The stress of the evolution would push every recruit to their breaking point, and for someone like Kyle, whose breaking point was already compromised, the additional pressure could be the final variable that tipped the equation from simmering to boiling. But she also knew that if Kyle's plan involved the mess hall, he would want to execute it before battle stations began, because once the evolution started, there would be no unstructured moments. No windows of semi-supervised normalcy where he could act without immediate and overwhelming response. That left this morning, breakfast. The last meal before the controlled chaos of battle stations. The last moment of routine before everything became extraordinary. If Kyle was going to make his move, it would be now. The sound of boots on pavement reached her ears at 0612, 3 minutes early. Division 189 was being pushed by their instructors, building the urgency that would carry them through the next 12 hours. She heard the counting, the cadence, the rhythmic breathing of bodies moving as one. Then the east doors opened and the recruits filed in. Sarah watched them enter with the microscopic attention she had perfected over 2 decades. She noted postures, gaits, facial expressions, the tiny indicators that told her the emotional temperature of each person who walked through that door. Most of them looked exhausted, but determined. A few looked scared. 1 or 2 looked like they were fighting back tears. All of this was normal for the morning of battle stations. Kyle entered near the middle of the formation, same as yesterday. He walked with the same mechanical precision, sat down at his assigned spot, placed his hands on his lap. But today, Sarah noticed something different. His hands were not pressed flat against his thighs. They were clenched into loose fists, the knuckles slightly white, the tendons in his wrists visible beneath the skin. It was a detail that 90% of the people in that room would never have noticed. Sarah noticed it instantly and felt her own body respond with the familiar chemical surge of adrenaline being released in controlled, measured doses. Not panic. Never panic. Just readiness, spreading through her muscles like warm water filling a cold pipe. The order came to eat. 300 recruits rose, moved to the food line, received their trays, and returned to their seats. Sarah watched Kyle through every step of the process. He moved normally, received his tray from a male server, and returned to his table. He began eating. Fork to tray, tray to mouth, chew, swallow, repeat. Mechanical. Automatic. The movements of a body running on autopilot, while the mind was occupied with something else entirely. Sarah picked up her own tray and began her patrol of the room. She moved slowly, stopping to check trays, making small talk with the instructors she passed. She was aware of Rodriguez's position near the food service line, a solid, immovable presence in a dark blue uniform. She clocked Hernandez near the east exit and Wallace near the west. The net was in place. She walked toward Kyle's section of the room. She was 15 feet from his table when it happened. There was no warning, no buildup, no escalation, no preliminary confrontation. One moment, Kyle Briggs was sitting on a metal bench eating scrambled eggs, and the next moment he was on his feet, spinning toward Sarah with a speed that would have caught anyone else completely off guard. His tray flew sideways, scattering food across the table. His chair shrieked against the floor, and his right hand was already cocked back, the fist tight, the elbow high, the shoulder rotating with the practiced mechanics of someone who had thrown this punch many times before and connected with it every single time. The mess hall seemed to freeze. 300 recruits stopped eating, stopped breathing, stopped existing as individuals, and became a collective audience to something their training had not prepared them to witness. The instructors at the corners of the room registered what was happening with the half-second delay of people who needed to process before they could react. Rodriguez, near the food line, was already moving, but he was 40 feet away, and 40 feet might as well have been 40 miles in the time it takes a fist to travel from a cocked position to a target. Sarah did not freeze. Sarah did not delay. Sarah did not even think, not in the conscious, deliberative sense of the word. What she did was something that lived below thought, in the deep architecture of muscle memory and trained response that 18 years of special operations had built into her nervous system. Her body moved the way it had been taught to move when a threat presented itself at close range, with the fluid, unhesitating efficiency of a system executing a program it had rehearsed 10,000 times. She saw the punch coming the way she had been trained to see it, not as a single action but as a sequence of micro-movements that she read like a sentence being written in real time. The shift of his weight to his back foot, the rotation of his hip, the extension of his shoulder, the tightening of his fist. Each of these movements took a fraction of a second, and together they added up to approximately 0.8 of a second. Between the initiation of the punch and its projected point of impact, which was Sarah's face, 0.8 of a second was an eternity in Sarah's world. She moved laterally. shifting her weight to her left foot and rotating her torso away from the incoming fist. Kyle's punch sailed past her right ear with enough force to create a small displacement of air that she felt against her skin. He had put everything into that punch, all 220 pounds of his body weight behind a fist that was aimed at the center of her face, and it had missed by less than 3 inches. The miss destabilized him. He had committed his weight forward, expecting the impact of his fist against bone to stop his momentum. Instead, his fist met empty air, and his body continued forward, pulled by its own force into a position that was overextended and unbalanced. For 1/2 second, Kyle Briggs was leaning forward, with his right arm fully extended and his center of gravity ahead of his feet, and in that half-second he was more vulnerable than he had been at any point in his life. Sarah exploited the vulnerability with the cold precision of a surgeon. She stepped inside his reach, rotating her body to face him, and delivered a controlled strike to his solar plexus with the heel of her right palm. The strike was not intended to injure. It was intended to interrupt, to reset his nervous system by hitting the cluster of nerves in his midsection that controlled breathing and balance. She could have hit him harder. She could have hit him in the throat, the temple, the bridge of his nose. Any of the targets that her training had taught her would end a fight instantly and permanently. But she did not want to end this fight with damage. She wanted to end it with control. The palm strike landed with a sound like a hand hitting a heavy bag, a deep, solid thud that seemed to vibrate through the air. Kyle's eyes went wide. His mouth opened in a silent gasp as the air left his lungs in a single involuntary exhalation. His forward momentum stopped as if he had walked into a wall, and for a moment he stood there, frozen in mid-motion, his brain trying to understand why his body had stopped responding to commands. Sarah did not wait for him to recover. In the same fluid motion, she stepped to his right side, hooked her left hand behind his right elbow, and applied downward pressure on his shoulder joint while simultaneously sweeping his right foot with her left ankle. The technique was a modified standing armbar that she had learned during her close-quarters combat training, designed to take a larger opponent to the ground without requiring superior strength. It relied on leverage, timing, and the structural weakness of the human shoulder joint when placed at an unnatural angle. Kyle went down. Not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, his legs folding beneath him as his brain prioritized protecting his shoulder over maintaining his balance. He hit the linoleum with a sound that silenced the last whispers in the room, and before he could process what had happened, Sarah had transitioned from the standing armbar to a prone control hold, her right knee pressed against his upper back between his shoulder blades, her left hand maintaining control of his right arm, and her right hand placed firmly against the back of his neck. He was on the ground, face down, completely immobilized, and the entire sequence, from his first movement to his current position, had taken less than 4 seconds. The room was absolutely silent. 300 recruits sat motionless on their benches, food forgotten on their trays, staring at the scene in the center of the room with expressions that ranged from shock to awe to something approaching reverence. The instructors, who had been rushing toward the commotion from their positions around the room, slowed to a stop as they registered that the situation was already under control. Rodriguez arrived first, his face tight with the controlled urgency of a professional who expected chaos and found order instead. He knelt beside Kyle and placed his own hands on the recruit's wrists, adding a second layer of restraint that was more procedural than necessary. Kyle was breathing hard, his face pressed against the cold floor, his body trembling with the combination of adrenaline, confusion, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his plan. He had expected his fist to connect. He had expected the satisfying impact of bone against bone, the familiar feeling of dominance that came with hurting someone who could not fight back. Instead, he had hit air, been hit once, and found himself on the floor in a hold he could not escape from, controlled by a woman who weighed 60 pounds less than him and who was not even breathing hard. Sarah held the control position with steady, even pressure. She did not increase the force. She did not speak. She simply held him there, pinned and powerless, and let the reality of his situation seep into his consciousness, one humiliating second at a time. She could feel his muscles testing the hold, the involuntary flexing of a strong body trying to find an angle of escape, and discovering that there were none. Each time he tensed, she made a micro-adjustment that negated his effort before it could build into anything useful. She was not fighting him. She was containing him the way a jar contains something that would be dangerous if released. Hernandez and Wallace arrived and took over the physical restraint. Sarah released her hold and stood up, stepping back to give them room. Kyle was rolled onto his back, his wrists secured with zip ties, and pulled to his feet by two instructors who handled him with the rough efficiency of people who had dealt with this kind of thing before. His face was red, not from impact but from exertion and shame. His eyes, which had been flat and empty when he launched his attack, were now wide and wet and filled with something that looked very much like the recognition of a terrible mistake. He was escorted out of the mess hall through the west exit. The doors closed behind him with a metallic clang that echoed through the silent room like a period at the end of a sentence. Sarah watched him go with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the entire encounter. Her heart rate was elevated but already declining. Her hands were steady, the adrenaline was receding from her bloodstream, replaced by the slow, warm clarity that always followed a controlled use of force. She had done what she needed to do, nothing more and nothing less. Rodriguez appeared at her side, his expression caught somewhere between relief and admiration. "Are you all right?" he asked, the mandatory question. "I'm fine," Sarah said. The mandatory answer. "That was the fastest takedown I've ever seen," Rodriguez said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that the recruits could not hear. 4 seconds. Maybe less. 3.8, Sarah said. She did not say it with pride. She said it with the factual precision of someone who had been trained to measure everything, including time. Rodriguez looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that said he had just updated his understanding of who she was in a fundamental way. Then he nodded, the same way her father used to nod, and walked away to handle the aftermath. The mess hall slowly returned to something resembling normal. The instructors restored order with sharp commands. Recruits returned to their meals. The food that Kyle's tray had scattered across the table was cleaned up. The routine of boot camp, that relentless, grinding, comforting routine, resumed as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and everyone in that room knew it. The recruits who had witnessed the incident would talk about it for the rest of their military careers. They would tell the story in barracks and wardrooms and bars, and each time they told it, the details would sharpen rather than fade. The woman instructor who took down the biggest recruit in Division 189 in less than 4 seconds without breaking a sweat. The woman who moved so fast that nobody saw what she did until it was already done. The woman who stood over a man 60 pounds heavier than her and held him on the ground with one knee like she was holding a door shut. They did not know who Sarah really was. They did not know about the training pipeline that did not exist in any public document. They did not know about the deployments, the operations, the scars, the 42-hour surveillance positions, the rooms she had cleared in countries whose names she could not speak. They did not know that the calm, unremarkable woman in the instructor uniform had spent 12 years doing the hardest things in the hardest places with the hardest people in the United States military. They just knew what they had seen, and what they had seen was enough. Kyle Briggs was processed through the base legal office that same day. The attack on a commissioned officer was documented, witnessed by approximately 312 people, and captured on the mess hall security camera from 2 angles. There was no ambiguity, no he said, she said, no question of interpretation. A recruit had thrown a punch at a lieutenant commander during a meal period, and the lieutenant commander had neutralized the threat with controlled proportional force. The legal proceedings were straightforward and swift. Kyle was separated from the Navy with an other-than-honorable discharge, which meant he lost all veterans' benefits, his GI Bill, and the fresh start he had been promised by the recruiter who had found him at that job fair in Houston. He was escorted off the base 48 hours after the incident, with his personal belongings in a cardboard box and a bus ticket to Houston in his back pocket. Sarah did not watch him leave. She did not need to. She had already moved on to the next training cycle, the next group of recruits, the next room full of 18-year-olds trying to become something more than they had been when they walked through the door. There would be other Kyle Briggses. There always were. The military attracted people looking for direction, and sometimes the people who needed direction the most were the ones least equipped to accept it. But the incident changed something on the base. Something subtle but real. The female instructors walked a little taller. The male recruits who had harbored quiet assumptions about what women could and could not do found those assumptions challenged in a way that textbooks and lectures could never accomplish. And Sarah, who had spent her entire career being invisible, found herself visible for the first time in a way that she had not chosen but could not entirely regret. 2 weeks after the incident, a young female recruit from Division 192 approached Sarah after a PT session and asked her a question that nobody had ever asked her before. "Ma'am, how did you learn to do that?" Sarah looked at the recruit, a 19-year-old from Michigan with determination in her eyes and uncertainty in her voice, and saw a version of herself standing at the edge of the woods with a flashlight, afraid to go in but too proud to say so. "I learned by showing up," Sarah said, "every day. Even when it was hard." "Especially when it was hard." The recruit nodded, not fully understanding but filing the answer away for later. The way seeds are filed into soil before they know what they are going to become. She thanked Sarah and jogged off to join her division, her ponytail bouncing with the energy of someone who had just received something she did not yet know how to name. Sarah watched her go and felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not pride exactly, although pride was part of it. Something wider. Something that felt like purpose renewed. Like the discovery that the skills she had spent a lifetime building were not just weapons to be deployed in dark rooms in dangerous countries, but tools that could shape people in ways she had never imagined. She turned and walked back toward the instructor office, her boots steady on the concrete, the Illinois wind pulling at her uniform. The bass was loud with the sounds of training, hundreds of voices counting cadence, the clang of equipment, the distant blast of a whistle signaling the start of another evolution. It was chaotic and exhausting and relentless and beautiful, in the way that only a place dedicated to transformation can be beautiful. Sarah Colton had spent her career in the shadows, doing work that no one would ever know about, earning respect that no medal could represent. She had been wounded, tested, broken, and rebuilt more times than she could count. She had walked into rooms that she was not expected to walk out of, and she had walked out of every single one. She had fought wars that were not hers to choose and survived them through a combination of skill, will, and a stubbornness that she had inherited from a father who believed that discomfort was education. And now, in a mess hall in Illinois, in front of 300 witnesses, she had done the simplest and most complicated thing a person with her abilities could do. She had protected. Not a compound, not an objective, not a strategic asset. A room full of kids eating scrambled eggs, and she had done it so cleanly, so quickly, and so completely that the person who had tried to bring violence into that room had been on the ground before the violence could land. That evening, alone in her quarters, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out the pocket knife her father had given her the day she enlisted. It was old and worn, the blade dulled by decades of use, the handle smooth from the grip of 3 generations of hands. She held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, not just the physical weight of metal and wood, but the weight of everything it represented. Sacrifice. Service. Silence. The willingness to do difficult things without needing anyone to know you did them. She thought about Kyle Briggs, sitting on a bus somewhere between Illinois and Texas, staring out the window at a future that had narrowed dramatically in the last 48 hours. She did not feel anger toward him. She did not feel satisfaction in his failure. She felt a quiet, complicated sadness for the waste of potential that his life represented, so far, and a stubborn, irrational hope that the experience of being brought to the ground by a woman he had underestimated might plant a seed in him the same way her words had planted a seed in that young recruit from Michigan. She knew the odds were against it. People like Kyle did not change easily. The patterns that had shaped him were deep, carved into his personality by years of chaos and violence, and the desperate need to feel powerful in a world that had made him feel powerless. Breaking those patterns required more than a single humbling experience. It required the kind of sustained, difficult, daily work that Kyle had never been taught to do. But Sarah also knew something about difficult, daily work. She knew that the impossible was just the possible. With more steps, she knew that the hardest thing she had ever done was not surviving a combat operation. or completing a training program that broke 90% of its candidates. The hardest thing she had ever done was showing up the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, when every part of her body and mind was telling her to stop. That was the real training, not the physical skills, not the combat techniques, not the intelligence analysis or the weapons proficiency or the dive qualifications. Those were tools. The training was the showing up, the relentless, unglamorous, agonizing act of being present for the hard thing one more time than you thought you could be. She closed the pocket knife and placed it on her bedside table. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind outside her window. The same wind that had been blowing since she arrived at Great Lakes. The same wind that would be blowing long after she left. It did not care about recruits or instructors or training cycles or the complicated histories of people trying to become something better than what they had been. In the morning, she would get up and do it all again. New recruits, new problems, new versions of the same old human struggle between what people are and what they could be. She would stand in mess halls and on training fields and in classrooms, watching and assessing and intervening when necessary, the same way she had always done, quietly and competently, and without the need for anyone to know the full story of why she was so extraordinarily good at it. But tonight, for just a few minutes before sleep took her, she allowed herself to feel something she rarely permitted. She felt proud. Not of the takedown, although the execution had been technically flawless. Not of the recognition she had received from Rodriguez and Patterson, and the commanding officer who had pulled her aside to say what she already knew. She felt proud of the choice she had made years ago to transition from operations to training. She had thought at the time that it was a step down, a concession to a body that was wearing out and a career that had reached its operational ceiling. But she understood now that it was a step forward, into a space where her skills could ripple outward in ways that a classified operation never could. The young recruit from Michigan would remember their conversation. Maybe not today, maybe not next month, but someday, at a moment when she needed to hear those words, she would remember. I learned by showing up. Every day. Even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. And maybe those words would keep her going for one more day, and then one more, and then one more after that, until she had built something inside herself that was strong enough to withstand whatever the world threw at her. That was the mission now. Not clearing rooms or neutralizing targets or gathering intelligence in hostile territory. The mission was passing on what she had learned to people who needed it. One conversation, one correction, one demonstrated truth at a time. It was smaller than what she had done before, and it was infinitely larger. Sarah Colton closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Her body settled into the bed with the controlled relaxation of a person who knew how to rest without ever fully letting go. The wind rattled the windows. The bass hummed with the quiet industry of 1,000 people sleeping before the hard work of another day. And in the mess hall, the lights were off, the tables were empty, the linoleum floor was clean and shining in the glow of the emergency exit signs. The room held no memory of what had happened there, no trace of the violence that had been attempted, or the precision with which it had been stopped. It was just a room. A room where people came to eat and left to train and occasionally, on rare and remarkable occasions, discovered that the world contained people who were not at all what they appeared to be. People like Sarah Colton, who looked like a math teacher and moved like a weapon, who spoke softly and struck precisely, who had spent a lifetime learning to be invisible, and who, in one unremarkable mess hall on one unremarkable morning, had become the most visible person on the base. Not because she wanted to be seen, but because someone needed to be stopped. And she was the one who could do it. She always had been, and she always would be.